From Boca Raton, Florida, this is Behind the Bima. On this episode, Rabbi Goldberg is joined by Miriam Haber to discuss the life and legacy of her son, Zechariah Haber, who was tragically killed fighting in Gaza. Miriam discusses Zechariah's remarkable life as a dedicated father, husband, scientist, and Torah scholar. Despite his achievements in academia and military service, Zechariah remained a humble and deeply religious individual. Miriam shares poignant stories and memories, emphasizing the importance of preserving his legacy and the profound impact he had on those around him. All this and more, Behind the Bima.
Miriam, thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation, to go behind the bima on Zechariah's life, Hashem Yikom Damo. I can't begin to imagine how difficult it is to revisit and communicate and share, but we want to memorialize our heroes, and Zechariah, great among them, going back to January when you and Am Yisrael lost him, to learn more about, because as heroic as the way he left the world and to be among our Kedoshim and sitting next to the Kisei HaKavod, that wasn't his whole life, and there is a legacy, and the world should know and learn from it. So can't begin to imagine, but unbelievably grateful for your willingness and openness to be able to have this conversation. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to teach about Zechariah to your audience. And generally, like, we try to focus on Zechariah's, what I call Zechariah's amazing life, because it was amazing. And although we are proud of him for his service in the war, it was like a tiny fraction of Zechariah's life. He was not a militant person, although he believed strongly in what led him to do Miluim every year and during the war from October 8th. But I don't want that to overshadow the beauty. His life was a beautiful life.
He was 32 years old?
He was 32 years old.
A father
of three small children who are now 6, almost 4, and 1.5. Married to a wonderful woman, Talia Friedman Haber, who made Aliyah as an adult. And Zechariah met her here, and they built a beautiful home.
How'd they meet?
They met through Points of Contact, which is a Facebook group for people suggesting shidduch ideas. Actually, I can give a shout out to a mutual friend, Sharon Fishman from Modi'in, who knew that Zechariah was looking for somebody Zechariah was not like a cookie cutter person at all. His values were like not cookie cutter. And he was looking for somebody to whom, like, really just the most important things, like Judaism and nature and family, those were the things that mattered to him. And he was looking for somebody like that as well. And Sharon, I remember she called me and said, this woman is like somebody somebody created this woman for Zechariah. And as one of our other sons has said, it was a miracle not only that Zechariah and Talia met, but that they even existed for each other, because there are certain similarities about them there.
Sometimes you could see in a couple that Hashem is mezavek zivugim.
Legamre.
You know confidently they were made for each other.
Yeah, for sure. And they were, very happy, very active. They started in Rehovot, where he was getting his master's at the time, and then they lived in Jerusalem for the next 6 years of his life.
A budding scientist, PhD candidate?
He was at the tail end of getting his PhD at Tel Aviv University in their School of Plant Science and Food Security. He was researching genetic engineering of wheat and other crops so that they could withstand climate change and other tough conditions. Because he had already published many articles, including during his master's in first-year scientific journals in his field, he was awarded his PhD after his death based on those published articles.
Wow.
So he is Dr. Zechariah Pesach Haber.
Wow.
Yeah.
And accomplished in the world of academia, but also accomplished as a Talmud Chacham. I know from my brother-in-law doesn't use that term lightly when he describes that Zechariah really was a Talmud Chacham.
Zechariah loved Torah. One of our other sons, Noam, wrote a beautiful Facebook post. Everything that I'm saying is on this amazing memorial website that my husband Aaron built, along with some help from Talia, ZechariahHaber.com. And Noam published a Facebook post about how there's a lot been said about Zechariah had a lot of loves. His primary love was for Talia and the children, and his us and the boys and his grandparents and huge extended families, etc. And his love of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael and but his love of Torah was like very deep. It would be difficult to describe how much he loved it. And Noam tried to like tell the funny story how he would come. Zachariah stopped sleeping. He went to Hesder Yeshiva, which I don't know if you're.
Sure.
Tell me what I'm supposed to explain.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
So he went to Alon Shvut to Shivat Har Etzion, and he learned around the clock there. Like one of the eulogies at his funeral was Rav Amnon Bazak, who taught Zachariah for a few years, and he described that Zachariah was like well known as one of the most diligent learners ever in the yeshiva, which there are quite a few diligent learners at Gush. But and what we didn't know, which we found out during Shiva from a Facebook post from a friend of his, was that he had, when he came back from his army service, he was a tank commander in his army service. When he came back in years 4 and 5, he decided that instead of spending night Seder going over like the morning shir, he would write a Talmudic encyclopedia of all Nosim and all of Shas, including Kodshim and Taharot. And and he spoke to the Rosh Yeshiva about that, and they said later that they thought, okay, that's a nice idea, and Zachariah is very learned and he's very diligent, but that's not realistic for a 22 and 23.
Right.
And at the
Like
end
your idea, go for it, try it.
Right. Like so at the end of Shir Hay, when he was on his way to university, he decided to go into the academic field immediately after. A friend said to him, like, as a joke, sorry, whatever happened to your encyclopedia? And he said, oh, I actually finished it. If you'd like the files, I can give it to you on a disk on key. And so that friend posted on Facebook about how Zachariah's love of learning was just extraordinary, and that story. And so we got the file from him, and actually Gosh is now, they've taken an editor and they're going to publish it.
It's not only how great in learning he was, but how humble he was.
Humble.
Who would finish a project like that?
No, so for Zachariah,
I write an article and the whole world has to like,
No.
Who would finish an encyclopedia and be like, oh yeah, I did finish that. If you wanted, I could dig it up for you.
He was extraordinarily modest. Like, and the difference between his capabilities and what he achieved and what he told people was like just very unusual. But what we've learned about what we call the Kuntris or Zachariah's Sefer is that Gush has started. The Orach Chaim is going to be published hopefully around his yurtzeit. And what they've done is they've taken like parts at our request that are related to the Chagim. They had it for Pesach, they had it for Shavuot, they had it for Chagei Tishrei, and they've published the edited version on their website. And then Aaron was asked by Mizrahi Worldwide if Zachariah had a Dvar Torah. And so he took what Zachariah had to say about Tshuva and wrote an English Dvar Torah based on what Zachariah said, because it's entirely in Hebrew, the book. It's not. And what we've learned is that for Zachariah, because it's a theme that repeats itself like throughout his work, was that mitzvot were a means for him to get closer to God. Like he would explain with respect to each mitzvah, like different approaches to it. And he was always quoting from and attracted to the Parshanim, either early or late, who said that you could use mitzvot to get closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's how he lived his life, really.
A real relationship.
Yeah.
Hashem wasn't some academic, conceptual, theoretical.
No, not at all. And actually, Rav Moshe Lichtenstein just gave a shiur in Zachariah's memory. There's this beautiful Mizrahi project that I know you interviewed Rabbi Shaw about. So there were several Sifrei Torah, Milei Sifrei Torah, dedicated in Zachariah's memory for Simchat Torah.
Right.
Mostly in America, but in Kilat Sharei, Menachem, where we had daven when we were here, they did one as well, which was beautiful. And Rav Moshe Lichtenstein came to speak about him, and he spoke about Mi'il Sifrei Torah halachically and hashkafically, which was a fascinating topic. Like I had never given thought to it at all. And he said that before preparing this year, he went to consult Zachariah's book to see what Zachariah had said. And he said it really is interesting because on each topic it reflects who Zachariah was. And he came to the Gush because he wanted sort of the Gush brisker derech, but he didn't limit himself that way. Like He brought in the Maharal, and he brought in Rav
I was
Kook.
going to say,
and
I didn't want to sound like an outsider or judgmental of it, but people picture the Gush, let's say.
As like a
we have a lot of
colder
family.
place.
Yeah, the rationalist,
Right.
Maimonidean.
Right.
And
so
to get to the Panemius,
so he was very knowledgeable and like knew the Calder sources, but
Right.
and was quite adamant actually about not adding chumrot to his own life. Like
Right.
but the sources that spoke to him most were the sources that were the Panemius, in other words, and that carries through throughout his sefer. And so for us, it's been quite. And because it's also interesting. He prepared that sefer before, as I said, like it was the first time he was leaving the Beit Midrash. I mean, he had gone to the army, but then he came back and he was learning. And he went to Hebrew University's Faculty of Agriculture. I don't know if any of your listeners know this. There are 3 campuses at Hebrew U, not the 2 that people know about.
Right.
2 are in Jerusalem, and 1 is in Rehovot, which is plant science and things related to that. And I guess we'll get to that at some point. But Zachariah chose to go into plant science, even though it was not at all a typical choice. I'm a lawyer. My husband's a programmer. It didn't come from our home. He did that out of like an incredibly deep, abiding love of Eretz Yisrael and Am Yisrael. Like that. It was for him, like Teva was part of his religiosity. It wasn't like this was his career and this was his
Right.
Torah. In other
It was
words,
a
he was
religious
one
expression.
person. It was a religious expression. But when he went there wasn't a very vibrant religious community on the campus. And so he took it upon himself to make sure there was a daily minyan 3 times a day. And he would have a Google Docs where he'd call people the night before. And he laned, because he laned beautifully, like really beautifully. But he was always a laner. And then during the Shiva, a friend that we did know from then came and told us 2 things about. One was that Zachariah, after making sure the minyan was like steady and stable, he showed us pictures. Zachariah used to give a shiur every day, like a short shiur, so people would know some Torah before they went off to school,
Right.
where he'd bring some regalach or whatever. And I said, how did he have time to prepare a shiur? Like, it doesn't make sense. In other words, he was double registered for courses at the same time because he couldn't choose which one interested him. And they said, oh, no, he used his book. And we didn't even know about the book at that time. And then when the other friend said he had this book where he covered every topic, I think part of why Zachariah prepared it was like he wanted to be able to be Marbitz Torah to others wherever he was. Like even if he was in a setting that was not kind of the most, kind of the most typical for a Ben Torah to be in. And the same friend told us a story that at the time, there was a small group, including Zachariah, in these dorms. Like there was a apartment where it was Shomer Shabbos, 5 guys with a Shomer Shabbos kitchen. And there was another group trying to get like what's called a student village started on the other side of Rehovot. And they said to one of the guys, why don't you guys come join us? In other words, it's hard enough to get. And they said, no, we'll only go if Zachariah goes. And he said to Zachariah, why don't you come? And he said, I can't leave this dorm because if somebody who otherwise wouldn't hear Kiddush wants to hear it and I'm not here, who will make Kiddush for them? And if you saw him, you wouldn't have seen. He was in what we call a dry fit T-shirt and shorts and shoes, I guess 340 days a year. In other words, he didn't look sort of like, though his tzitzit with the tchelet were always out, et cetera, but his love of Judaism was so, it was so deep.
Everything about him sounds so modest and so personal, where so many other people are living it for others. Look how religious I look. Look what camp I fit into.
Right, he didn't.
Look at the sefer I published. It was so
It was not of any
internal
interest to him for people to know any of these things about him.
Right.
I mean, Talia didn't know that he had written that book. On the academic side, he had been awarded a lot of like very unusual fellowships because his advisor that we've gotten to know quite well, arranged for like things that normally PhD students would not be eligible for that he would, and we didn't know that. That he would say to Talia, oh, something good happened at work, why don't we go get a shake at Rebar or something? Like it also was like a level of modesty in how they live. That's hard to describe.
There's so much to learn from. My sister was pointing out that so many, particularly of the young soldiers, and what a difficult week it's been for Am Yisrael.
Terrible.
But so much of the loss is the young lives they've lived, but it's also the prospective loss of how much they had to live and how much they had to give. And in Zechariah's case, certainly too, as a father and future grandfather and scientist and Talmid Chacham, how much of our future we're deprived of that we should have had. But there's also what he accomplished, and that's why this conversation is so important. Everything you're describing.
Yeah, I
that he
mean, what
already had.
we've decided is that there's the primary, like, excruciating loss of Zechariah not being with us, not being with Talia and his brothers, and but there's also the secondary loss that we're fighting to avoid. Like, if his legacy of good is wiped out as well, it's like this horrible additional secondary loss. And so we're doing a lot of things to memorialize him, and like, it's a wide variety because his life was a wide variety of beautiful things. One of the things that Rav Lichtenstein said that touched me very deeply was that he described, Me'ilas a Beged for Sefer Torah, and he described that Zechariah had this extraordinary ketonat pasim because he had so many pasim that each one on their own would have been exceptional. Like, how amazing of a father and husband he was. So the pas of the mishpacha, pas of Torah, on its own would have been extraordinary. The pas of his love for Eretz Yisrael, which was, he loved seeing the world, but this was the only place, and I'm sorry, wait, am I allowed to say this on your
Yes.
podcast? That goes out and okay.
I say it all the time.
For him, there was no other place that he would have felt blessed to live. Like, it just was the only natural place for
Right.
certainly for a religious Jew, but I think he thought it extended beyond that. His love of Am Yisrael, he went to war to protect Jewish people. His love of science, and his love for Tikkun Olam. In other words, when he picked to study how to address food scarcity, he wanted to make the world a better place. And so, like, the combination of all of those things in one person was just this extraordinarily colorful. Also, literally, he wore very brightly colored T-shirts and shorts that didn't necessarily match, but that was part of his yofi.
Right. What a tapestry.
Yeah.
Can you come back to, I think that the greater world out there who don't know Israel and don't know the Jewish people, they can't reconcile, or they picture the IDF, these soldiers, and they must be militant and they must be violent and they must love violence and death. And you describe Zechariah as this, you don't picture a nature-loving scientist who cares about the environment and cares about, Torah study as somebody who can go to war. And obviously the only way to reconcile them is because he was doing it to defend the Jewish people who are his family, the land, the people that he so loved. And it has nothing to do with being militant, nothing to do with being violent, nothing to do with loving death, but the opposite.
Right. He went to war. He wrote to somebody, again, things we saw afterwards during the war, that he went to war after the second day of the war. His group got to their base and got the tanks ready. They were tanks that were supposed to have been sold to some other country because they were so old and, like, barely functional. And now they're in full use, for a year plus. And that next day they got to Be'eri and Nachal Oz. And he saw terrible things. He didn't want to talk about it with us. Aaron picked him up the first time he got out. These breaks are called afterim, which you may have heard about from nephews or nieces. And he was shaken, but he took literally every second of every after that he had and ran around with the kids. They were at the zoo. They were at the aquarium. They were visiting his grandmother. He was cooking with them. He was doing what they call shtuyot, which is pillow fights and, just fun Abba stuff. He wasn't, he never turned down a request to show up. But when he was home, he wasn't just home, he was, like, fully home. He had a friend who was on the same schedule after him, and they'd come back sometime, usually Sunday morning, but not only. And he would say to Zechariah, okay, you were home for 48 hours, and I was home for 48 hours. Show me your pictures. So he showed him pictures from the Jerusalem Zoo and the aquarium and the Gan Soccer and here and that. And then Zechariah would say, oh, what did you do? He goes, oh, here's my picture. It's a selfie on the couch. I was very tired.
Right.
So he wasn't more tired than Zechariah was. He just was.
Right.
But he saw things in Be'eri and Nachal Oz that he thought the Jewish people should not. Like, it can't be that this is a risk that we're expecting people to take, to be victims of pogroms in Israel. I mean, it's not. And so he was the furthest thing from a militant person. Like the Hebrew word is hazoi, but it's like hazoi to me that he died in a battle. I mean, it's not that he was there because he believed in being there. No one, I want to shout out here to the reservists of this country. First of all, the regular army soldiers are extraordinarily brave as well. But the whole concept of the reservists in this country is just, I don't think there's some other system that runs this way, and that you have people who have spent a year endangering themselves, endangering their livelihoods, being injured, being killed. And there's, and they do this because they know that the country needs them. It's like a level of solidarity that's very hard to communicate to people. And he was in tanks, which is bichlal, like a level of solidarity that's hard to explain, I think, or to really understand.
Sacrifice, risk.
Yeah. And so he didn't want to be at war. He did do Miluim every year. After Hesder, he was in one Miluim unit, and then it was shut down for some reason. I don't know what, but he made sure to place himself. Like he wasn't willing to live here without doing Miluim. So he was in the same unit with a lot of, like some of the guys that we now know quite well, knew him for 10 or 12 years. He also believed very strongly in being with Israelis of all types. Like when he was in Hesder, when Hesder guys go in, they normally are promised that they'll be in units only with other, it's called Beinishim, which is Bnei Yeshivot. But as a tank, he was a navigator at the time. Like you're trained for a specific task. So pretty early on when he got out of that training, he was moved to a mixed unit of religious and non-religious soldiers, which I hate at this point using those terms because it's absurd to me that somebody who's endangered themselves for a year for the Jewish people, like the external, how people define other people is really crazy in my mind. But, and I remember saying to him, "Oh, are you disturbed that they moved you over? Like, you could call the Igud Yeshivot Hester." And he said, "No, Ima, just leave it. It's fine." And I think he connected to people like of every background. It was impossible. I was one of the guys who came to the Shiva said, Zechariah was a consensus. It was impossible not to love Zechariah. It was because he spoke to everybody. He was interested in everybody. And so he just connected with them.
And also, if everyone's a member of your family, then you're not as concerned of a sibling, how religious, not because they're your sibling.
And if
you really feel the Jewish people are your family, then you're your family.
He definitely felt that everybody in the country was part of his extended family, even if they drove him crazy sometimes. But yes.
So I want to hear more about the scientific research and what he was going to do. But what help us learn and grow, unfortunately, in this growing number of people, and hope that there are no more at all. But as we go forward, what are the things that people can say and do that give you some, if there is even possible, comfort? Understanding that the loss, people can't bring him back, but the secondary loss we can help you not experience, to make sure that his legacy endures, that his story is told, that his impact is felt, that his influence and inspiration continues to be had. So help all of us, not just with you, with unfortunately these other families.
I think that I think there's actually a variety of bereaved people, and what I've learned is that you go into this horrible situation that you never wanted to be in, but you go in as the person that you were, right? Like Aaron and I are both fairly introverted, so we've come in as introverts, and we're dealing with it as introverts. There are people who are much more extroverted, and so those skills or whatever, everything has pluses and minuses, and that's how you go through it. So I don't know if I can say sort of broadly what other bereaved people would feel. I do think that for me, people talking about Zechariah is comforting to me. I know it's very difficult to know as a non-bereaved person what the bereaved person wants to hear.
And there's a lot of fear and apprehension.
For
because
sure.
Someone sees you, maybe that day you just want to shop for the milk and you didn't want to be stopped to hear some amazing thing about Zechariah.
Right. So I personally always want to hear Zechariah. Right. In other words, for me, that's always my preference. You're right. There might be people who just need to kind of disengage and not hear about it. But I think it's also okay to ask. Like, somebody had said to me she never mentioned him, and it seemed like increasingly odd. And then it came up where she thought that it would be painful for me if I heard about it. I'm like, Zachariah's with me 24/7.
Right.
There's never a moment of a day that I'm not thinking about Zachariah.
And you can't make this more painful.
So
Like,
the
that's
pain,
not gonna
like,
be the thing.
the pain is there. In other words, the pain is constant. It's, there are days where it's like off the Richter scale for a variety of reasons, and then there are days where it's like regular level pain that
Right.
But not talking about him is worse. So that's our approach.
But it's interesting. So if someone were to say to you, a close friend or even an acquaintance that says, I have thoughts or memories, or sometimes I want to share something with you, is that meaningful, or would you rather I not? It's okay.
So
to
I would
even ask.
always like to hear, and it's an interesting other question. Like, I actually like that so many people were touched by Zachariah and loved him. We have a Memories of Zachariah WhatsApp group that one of Zachariah's brothers set up at the Shiva, and he put a QR code there, and 200 people are in the group. There are even people in the group that I didn't know they were in the group. Somebody posted on Simchat Torah, somebody who had been at the Shiva, who was apparently the last civilian that spoke to Zachariah. There's this beautiful mifal of chesed, like right outside the border of the Otef, where retirees have set up a tent, and the soldiers can go shower there, and they can go get food there, and it's an amazing thing. And Zachariah, who unfortunately was killed with somebody else, driver of the tank, Zachariah was the loader. His name was Yair Katz, Zichrono Livracha, of Cholon, a wonderful family. We've since become close with them. And Zachariah and Yair ran out in the morning to get breakfast and stuff for the other people in the tank because they knew they had a tough day ahead of them. And they wanted lefanekotam, like that they would have good food. And so they spoke to these two guys. And then the next day, they turn on the radio, and the worst two words in the Hebrew language, hutar lepersum, which, like, before the war,
Right.
I never even thought about.
Cleared for publication.
Yeah, cleared for publication. And they saw the faces and said, "Oh my God, these are these two." And Yair explained how he was 34. He wasn't married. He had started a startup. He has a very interesting story as well. And Zachariah was in scientific research working on crop scarcity, and was a young father. And they spoke. Zachariah and Yair asked them to hear about their expenses in the Yom Kippur War, which is when they said, Zachariah or Yair said to them, "That was your turn. Now it's our turn to save the country." And then they discovered that they had died. So that guy posted in the Memories group that on Simchat Torah in his shul in Shoham, he got up and spoke about Zachariah and Yair. And so this community of memories is actually, every morning I put up a picture of Zachariah. They're all smiling. It's like thousands of pictures of him smiling, like a smile from within. In other words, it's not. And sometimes they're like themed. In other words, actually, it's very nice. Like 11 babies have been named after Zachariah. So if it's somebody who had a baby and named it, then it's like a mazel tov with usually the picture of the people who knew Zachariah. Sometimes some of them have not even known him and named a baby after him. And so I have a very large extended family. Like, I'm one of 7. And early on, and they're grappling with the loss, my siblings and the cousins. It's just horrible for them. Like, he was very, very integral in the family. He would initiate these huge family gatherings, and he'd make sure that people of every age came. And then every family simcha, Shabbat, he would go from table to table, speaking to the 3-year-old and the 23-year-old, and asking who wanted to play a game. And he and Talia would make games. It's just, this massive whole. And one of my sisters-in-law reached out and asked if I would mind if, everyone's feeling his loss, and she had this idea to create pendants, which I wear, but other people use them as keychain holders, so which have Zachariah's like cute portrait and his signature. And I said, well, why would I mind? And she said, oh, do you feel like we're kind of appropriating? And I'm like, no, the more people that remember and love Zachariah, the better to me. Like, I don't, it's comforting for me to know that other people remember him and think about him. And that's true of people who didn't know him as well. Like, people who learn about him and are touched by him. We've also been, like, I've been floored by, I posted 2 blog posts. I never blogged before Zachariah died. And I posted 2 things in Times of Israel. And the second piece, the first piece actually was about my experience saying Yizkor for Zechariah on Pesach, which was a nightmare. I was crying hysterically in shul. And I basically switched shuls. Aaron switched shuls to say Kaddish because he wanted to be in the same minyan every day, and he didn't want to split between a Shabbos minyan and a week, whatever. And so I joined him there, and somebody came over to me, and most people just sat there because nobody knows what to do when there's a crying bereaved mother or any other bereaved person. And somebody came over, and who I grew up with her husband, but it wasn't a close relationship. And she just like put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Are you okay? Do you want me to stand here?" Which was just like a tiny kindness, but it meant the world to me. So, like, I think other people have said to me, "Oh, I would never have known that you'd want me to do that." And I said, "Okay, but just ask. If you see somebody in distress, look, there's so much horrible pain right now in this country. It's, for over a year. I mean, 56 orphans this week. Like, it's just things that we never imagined that we'd be experiencing as a nation at this point. I mean, we knew we experienced terrible things before, but we had thought we had kind of moved on from that. And I think it's natural to sort of be put off by other people's grief and not want to cause them more pain, or just it's awkward or whatever. I do think, like, asking people, would you want help in this scenario? The person will either say yes or no. And if it's yes, it's a massive chesed that doesn't
communicate, because the disappearance, the withdrawal, it only compounds pain. So at least communicate and ask.
Right.
It's, as a, particularly for those who don't yet live in Israel full time, you're sort of a consumer of this information with these headlines or the alerts, and which we check every 3 seconds of the entire day, to the degree that sometimes family in Israel think you're better informed. Because when you're in Israel, you just have to live.
Right.
And you're living it. You don't need to be informed. And when you're outside of Israel, you have so many groups and alerts, and God forbid it could ever become a point that soldiers are statistics. Like, how many was it today? And it's so important. That's why this conversation, and we're so grateful to you, is there's a name. We have to say their name and learn their story and perpetuate their story. And it's not a statistic. It's not a number. These are our children and our siblings and our fathers and mothers and daughters. And we have to learn their names and their story.
Right. And that's true, even if it's painful to look at the pictures. In other words, I'm sure it's agonizing. There's so many people in your community that love Israel.
Yeah.
And I feel sometimes like if I scared to open the news. I'll give an example. Erev Simchat Torah, I saw the second announcement of 5 Chayalim killed, and I thought it was the first one. And then I said, Kilo Elohim, like, this just can't be that it's another 5. Like I said, those are not the same 5 beautiful
You can't take another sip of your coffee. You can't.
Right.
Whatever you were doing has to be interrupted.
Right. But I know that that's hard for people. But for us, the people who have lost our children or our spouses or our brothers or our sisters or whatever it is, it means so much to us to personalize that loss. Like, because otherwise it's just wipes out his 32 years of living. Like, it just turns in, it just erases everything beautiful about the way he chose to live.
Right. And I'm sure weeks like this, with there been so many losses, just compound that pain.
Well, it's also this tiny world. His oldest daughter started first grade in a religious public school in Baca, because we live in Arnona, right across Derech Hebron. And unfortunately, and the school is incredibly supportive and kind about her being recently bereaved. But another little boy who had just recently relocated from Sfat with his family is in the other class in first grade. It's just sort of this endless web of connections that's also hard to convey.
Yeah, well, he was in Olet too. I just
yes, from Brooklyn.
Yeah, unbearable. Tell us more about Zechariah. Tell us about the scientific work he was doing, what he did, and what he wanted to still do.
Okay. And then I also want to tell you that Zechariah was funny and fun, because I sometimes worry that, like, I'm describing somebody that sounds like you. Yeah. But he wasn't, like, he just was warm and friendly, and he loved emojis, and he loved The Simpsons and Friends and museums all over the world and Tziyulim everywhere. And Zechariah's work combined, and I hope I'm going to say this right because I'm not a scientist and I'm not sure. I certainly do not fully understand what Zakaria did. But what we've seen in Rehovot and in Tel Aviv, because Rehovot was where he did his master's. So in Rehovot, they showed us a robot where Zakaria had engineered the software that measures the impact of hundreds of different input on little tiny cells of certain small plants. And they're still using it years later. And that allows them to figure out, like precisely at a cellular level, how to maximize crop production. Now, when he did that, a master's student in that lab would not normally have programmed it. In other words, there's a budget in the lab's, there's a line item in the lab's budget for a software engineer who does that. And Zakaria said, no, this is something I'm going to figure out. And he did it. And they're still using it, and they're using it in further experimentation. And he did a better job of that than somebody else would have done. In Tel Aviv, he continued that work, but he wanted to work on wheat, which is why he went there. Tel Aviv University has like a library, like an actual physical library of thousands of wheat genes, including what's called the Em Hachita, the original Eretz Yisrael wheat from thousands of years ago.
Eretz Chita.
The people who work there are extraordinarily kind people, which I guess it's a self-selecting group of people who research agriculture in Israel.
Yeah.
They came to the Shiva many times, and then since then they hosted us for a symposium about his work, and we actually are raising money for academic prizes and seminars in Zacharia's memory. That his doctoral advisor, who's like he's an exceptional scientist, but he's also an exceptional person. And funnily enough, his name is Nir Sadeh. Sadeh means field, so it's a strange coincidence. And he took massive quantities of data and did like big data analysis on, I don't even know how many hundreds of thousands of pieces of data he was analyzing to see how he could isolate the gene for wheat, which would be correlated with doing well in drought conditions. And he did manage to find that. And his advisor explained to us when he brought us in for a day, because he realized that Zakaria had only told us he worked on wheat. We didn't know anything else about what he did. So he invited us and the extended family in. And he said to Zakaria, okay, you've proven you're right theoretically, but I won't publish it from my lab unless you actually prove it before, like in practice. And he did. In other words, the theory that he had developed based on analyzing these massive quantities of data correlated exactly with the actual gene. And so that's what he was hoping to do. He was hoping to, and they actually, Zakaria and Talia had agonized for years. Normally in Israeli academia, the people who finish PhDs and want to continue in academia have historically been required to do postdoctorates in America or Europe. He did not, they had thought of doing that. He did not want to go, and Talia didn't want to go live in America. In a scientific field, it's like 5 years. They didn't want to have the kids move to America for 5 years and come back. And he was increasingly worried about being an Israeli academic on an American campus. Like he also wouldn't have hidden that he was Israeli or Jewish. Like he couldn't have, and he didn't want to be in that situation. But they had developed a position for him that would have allowed him to stay at that Machon, the Grain Institute of Tel Aviv, without doing a postdoc.
We go to the supermarket, we buy bread. Like the most people do is feed their sourdough. But we don't appreciate that there are scientists who are
actually, yes, there was
caring,
one point
working,
at which
innovating.
He brought home like some huge quantity of like wheat kernels and would spend hours. He went through, but the interesting part is that he integrated like this, the forefront of bioinformatics with plant cell biology. And everyone else in our house, other than me, and Zakaria's three brothers are all programmers, and Aaron's a programmer. And every so often, they talk about programming a lot. And every so often, Zakaria would say some off the mark, like, "Oh, I hate that language," and everyone would look at him and say, "How do you you don't program? Like, where is this coming from?" And he never said, "Oh, I've educated." His advisor set him up with an expert who's a friend of his in bioinformatics, so that he could be working at a graduate level in bioinformatics, even though that friend initially said to him, this doesn't make any sense. If this is what you need to get a candidate who actually has a BA and master's in bioinformatics. And he said, no, this guy can, like, he's taught himself a lot of things. He'll be fine. And he was fine. But he didn't say to any of us, other than saying he needed to come use the Wi-Fi in our apartment because they didn't pay for Wi-Fi. They used mobile data because they were very frugal. We didn't know he was dealing with big data. And my theory about that is that he didn't want his brothers to feel like, even in their field, Zacharia was there.
Right.
Like, he didn't want
That's the
them
humility.
to feel, like,
That's
he
the
didn't
humility,
want to
yeah.
step on their toe. Like, he wanted to leave that to them so they wouldn't feel that their older brother, who was Mimela, sort of, so good and so this and so that, was also, an expert in
And he did it with a
programming.
smile, with a sense of humor,
Everything.
with fun.
Everything was fun.
What were some of his hobbies? How did he have fun?
Well, first of all, he loved to run. How did he have fun? He loved to, as I said, there were certain shows that he liked watching. Just always like doing something interesting. Like, he liked crafts, actually. He liked to paint some things. He liked making things. He liked teaching himself languages, which sounds very brainiac. He would take, and this is from being a teenager, he would take a book that he had read in Hebrew or English, like Harry Potter, and then he would buy the same book and a dictionary in Amharic, in Russian, like in those alphabets. In other words, he taught himself not only languages, but not only other
Speaking,
languages, but
right.
alphabets as well. He was always just out and about and having a good time. He loved going to the Tachana in Jerusalem. He loved going to parks. He loved hiking anywhere. He hiked up Mount Hermon, even though everyone else took like the car up, and it was a closed military zone. He always marched to the beat of his own drummer. And I could say, I would like to say to parents that, like, some of the most amazing things that kids will do is when they march to the beat of their own drummer. Like, it wasn't that this came naturally to us. Like, oh, Zacharia's going to go study agriculture. In other words, I said at the time, gee, I know you love it, but is that realistic? Like,
Right. Is that a
maybe you
livelihood?
need to be a programmer. Maybe you need to be a doc. It's maybe you need to do one of these things that every single other person does that's finishing Gush or that you're related to.
Right.
And he said, no, this is what I'm going to do. It'll be fine. We didn't know he wrote this book, but I do have this vague memory of him saying to me in Shir Daled, oh, yeah, I'm learning something different than the yeshiva curriculum. And I said, oh, is that okay? Like, is the yeshiva all right about that? And he always just said to me, Ima, don't worry. It's fine. It's fine. We didn't know. Actually, the last part of his PhD, he did mostly from home. And we would say to each other, like, is he even getting his, like, what is going on here? Is it okay with the university? Like, he's supposed to be in a lab. Like, and it turned out, he was very loved in the lab. I mean, they were, he contributed massively to the lab. He was the first PhD student there and had a massive impact. But the work he was concentrating on could be done from home because it was that. And his advisor said he realized very quickly that Zacharia's passion for seeing his children and Talia meant that he wasn't going to be in the lab 5 days a week, 12 hours. He said, I realized that if I expected of him to do what any other PhD student would do, he wouldn't finish his PhD. He wasn't willing to not see his children and his wife. Mm-hmm. And his mind was so capable. So we basically had him split he would come in once a week, arrive at 6 a.m., leave at 8 p.m., and every 10 minutes he'd be doing, like, he'd plan everything out the way he planned his Torah study and everything else. And then in between, other people in the lab, like, he could direct them from far, like on the most like technical physical work. And he worked on his laptop so that he could be with his kids and his wife. I mean, that's how much he loved them.
Yeah.
So when you think about what it meant for him to go off to war, even in a scenario where, I mean, I think it's natural for people who go off to war to be worried about it, especially after they've seen what he saw. But even just the sacrifice of his time with his children and Talia was a huge sacrifice for him. This wasn't somebody who liked being out of the house. Like, he built how he did his career around his love of his family.
Such an important point. What would, if you're comfortable answering this, if Zacharia had to comfort a bereaved family who were struggling, even religiously struggling, how Hashem, how God, What do you think Zachariah how would he comfort? I don't mean the mechanics, would he walk up to them in the supermarket or during Yizkor, but I mean as somebody who wrote this sefer, as somebody who had this most authentic, deep, real relationship with Hashem, do you think Zachariah would have a message for the bereaved family who lost a husband, a child, a father in this way?
I don't know. His very good friend that he went to high school with and Gush with was killed 5 weeks before Zachariah, Ari Zenelman. I don't know if it's a name that you've...
They lived in Boca for a short time.
Oh, okay. And then in Ma'ale Adumim, a wonderful guy. And he and Chava, his wife, are friends as couples with Talia and Zachariah. They did Purim students together. It was one of his closest friends. And he spent a lot of one after, like at the funeral. And I don't know. I think like the rational part of Zachariah would have said, look, Jews should live in Israel, and unfortunately, we're surrounded by genocidal enemies who don't want that to happen. And so there's this terrible... But the heart of Zachariah, I don't... He was not one... you read these letters that Chayalim are writing, like, if something happens to me... He didn't write those letters. He desperately wanted to live. Not desperately enough not to do Miluim. In other words, he felt strongly that he wouldn't abandon his pluga and he would do what he viewed as the right thing. But this was not like one of these stories of somebody who grew up, with he insisted on doing combat, even though I, as a nervous mother, I remember very clearly the conversations where I tried to convince him to use his academic skills and to do something else. And he told me as a 20-year-old that A, his blood was not richer than any other Israelis. And B, that if, in battle, smart people are needed. And so if everyone who could leave Kravi would do so, we wouldn't be able to win any battles. And unfortunately, he turned out to be right. And it was this fantasy that Israel could rely entirely on high tech, and it turned out not to be correct. Right. I mean, it's an important component, but obviously it doesn't work on its own. So I don't know what Zachariah would say. I personally... I draw comfort, as I said, from memorializing Zachariah and from, I go to therapy, which the government actually funds. We go to a support group. I write Zachariah letters. We have this memorial group. We did a beautiful tiyul in his memory because he in 2019, rockets fell in the South. Rockets fell in the South for ages. And it drove him crazy that children in the South were expected to grow up with fear. 2019, he decided that from then on, he would go celebrate part of every Yom HaAtzmaut in the South and wrote us a beautiful text about how it can't be that rockets fell till 3 days before and we're all going to pretend like this is normal, but we're not in mourning. So if you were going to go barbecue in Park Hayarkon in Tel Aviv, go barbecue in Ashkelon. If you were going to go take a hike in Netanya, go take a hike in... Of course, now the North is equally, applicable. So in his memory, on Yom HaAtzmaut, we organized an amazing, beautiful... family hike and get together down south. And so that's what I find helpful. I personally don't find, I'm not looking for theological answers. I think very bad things happen to very good people.
You won't find them, right.
And I also feel like I don't, I think this war is very justified and very necessary. Like I believe, we built our lives here, very Zionist. I believe that, we have the right to live here. We have the right to live here without people being kidnapped from their own homes and tortured. But I don't know that this means anything in terms of redemption or Mashiach. To me, presuming that we're not living in a time of Nevuah, God's not in direct communication with us. So I'm not looking for those. There are people that find that very helpful. I'm just not one of those people.
Right. Getting to the end of each day.
Yeah. Exactly.
Preserving his memory. Remember, thank you for opening up, sharing.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
ZachariahHaber.com.
Yes, it's 2 H's. ZechariahHaber.com.
I know I and others
info.
will want to continue to learn and to keep his memory alive, but not as a favor to him or to you, but because there's so much to learn and be inspired by. I am from this conversation, as I know countless others will be as well. So I know it wasn't and isn't easy, but thank you for spending the time and opening your heart.
Thank you. And thank you for coming to Israel so frequently and for sharing your thoughts with your congregants. It's important.
Thank you.
Thank you.